Let's go over to the States now and talk about the Federal Reserve. An increasing number of Americans are now realizing that it is a corrupt organization and was definitely not set up to benefit the American people.
Well, that is correct, and it's worth just making a few little comments about the Federal Reserve System. We started off in Venice with 12 apostles, they were called, and the Doge of Venice making up the structure of the central bank. A substructure within that was 7 men who were called the 7 wise governors. And it's quite interesting that as the Bank of England is formed, so it turns out to be what are called the 7 immortals, or the 7 men who stepped forward to create this, what at that time was a ferocious bank. In America, when it comes to the Federal Reserve System, 7 men joined together to create the Federal Reserve System at Jekyll Island. So we've got 7 bankers. And they represented roughly a quarter of the wealth of the entire world, we are told. Federal Reserve systems are such that the American worker today earns about 30% less than he did in 1973. After tax and 2 paychecks, the income is not equal to a single income of 30 years ago. One of the bankers concerned, in this case Rockefeller, claimed that the equality movement, bringing of course employment to most women, had been created by the bankers for the very simple reason that they wished to create the pool of taxes that go to them and go to the Federal Reserve System. 40% of the money generated by American workers, 40% of taxation, that is, pays off the Federal Reserve debt on a continual basis. So that is why, when you look at the Federal Reserve System, you begin to see America in trouble. The way they started to fund America was quite simple. The 7 men said to the American government, "Would you like several million?" And the American government said, "Yes, we would." And so they simply printed money, and that was that. No gold or silver changed hands, just simply the printing of money. And then it was left to the American taxpayer to pay back the debt plus a large amount of interest. And you'll note that in this system of the Federal Reserve System, they can just alter the interest rates as and when they want. So they're inexplicable changes in interest rates, which are obviously very beneficial for those who do it. In 1910, the 7 bankers met in secret on Jekyll Island using only first names and steered through this whole process, which came to power in 1913. The bank is like Lombard's, and it's quite interesting to say that the Federal Reserve System is run from Geneva, and all the people who make up its shareholders are foreigners. So the bank, it doesn't even belong to America anyway. Geneva, of course, is the home of the United Nations, which was formed by the same bankers, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, and Bank of International Settlements. And we'll come on to the Bank of International Settlements, but that was actually founded under the surface by J.P. Morgan Banking and all the allied bankers attached to him. So was the Federal Reserve System. So you begin to see what is emerging. The first governor of the bank was Paul Warburg, and I believe that you will find his ancestry in Venice, the origin of that family, Abraham del Banco. Of the banking families running the Federal Reserve System, and this, I believe, was the situation, and may be the situation, is Rothschild of London, Rothschild of Berlin, Lazard Frère of Paris, Saif of Italy, Kung Loeb of Germany, and Sachs, with influences from the Rockefellers too. So that is basically the bank that is running America. This bank can simply create inflation and depression when it wants to, and it can dictate, I suppose, USA policy, because it is the source of the most monumental debts. And one of the things that Americans might like to find out, and can't find out at the moment, is exactly the size of these debts. One very good article recently and talk that I heard made the point from America, so we're not talking to America but simply learning quite a lot from them. This remark about the Federal Reserve went as follows: the Federal Reserve is incapable of accomplishing the stated objectives. It is a cartel operating against the public interest. It's a supreme instrument of usury. It generates our most unfair tax. It encourages war, and it destabilizes the economy. Now, the creator of this bank was J.P. Morgan. We talk about a company rather than a person, I think, here. But you know that he generated deliberately the stock market crash of 1929. So that is the founder working with other bankers of the Federal Reserve System. In America, one of the agents, in this case a Rothschild agent, when this stock market crash took place, was called Bernard Baruch. And he converted all his shares and everything, stocks, the lot, into silver coinage before the crash came. So you're beginning to see in America a problem, which I think is probably quite significant. When you want to get to the basis of the problem in America, I'm going to say it is the Federal Reserve System.
Whilst we're on the subject of the United States, wasn't the War of Independence instigated by the Bank of England?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, and of course our history is rewritten by something called the Round Table, and so one has to go back to roots to begin to look at this. The Bank of England, in fact, started to interfere with the American currency and the rights that Americans had previously enjoyed, and so we are actually beginning to look at the Lombard Bank of England, not the present Bank of England, through its foreign shareholders, and they were all foreign and are at that stage at least listed. It began the aggression against America. Now, you might think that the War of Independence was a war between Britain and America. It most certainly was not. Britain was still suffering from a Lombard invasion, and the independence that was to come, the Lombards hoped, would be the acquisition of America, its raw materials, its banks, and so much more. Masonry, or Red Masonry I think we might call it, in the American War of Independence, the lodges in Boston were all generated from Switzerland with money coming in to cause the war, so we're talking about Geneva now. The type of masonry I've looked at which caused the War of Independence is Swiss Masonry, and I have actually traced the origin of the aggression against America to the Seven Sisters Lodge in Paris, where Benjamin Franklin used to hang out with Voltaire and Venetian agents. I've also traced that through to the Hellfire Clubs in Britain, where the espionage was set up which undermined the British Navy and the British Army. So that putting these together, actually they're in my book, but the war between America and Britain didn't really occur in that way at all, and there were people under the surface, bankers under the surface, who were intent upon changing the nature of America, and they still are, because they're still after the Constitution. It's also true to say, and again I've mapped this out in some detail in the book, that the American Civil War had very little to do with Americans falling out with each other. The Lombard agents were on both sides of that war and instigated it from start to finish. It didn't just happen. And I have traced the process whereby this occurred. I can tell you that B'nai B'rith, which is a secret organisation, Red Masonry, the Young Movement, these groups underneath the surface, which are all Lombard in origin, caused that war, and I've got the process in the book. It's just worth saying in passing that the same lodges that I've just talked about were established in the Middle East at about the same time as the American Civil War, and that led on to something which we know about, which is called the Muslim Brotherhood.
So what do you think has emerged as a result of the Civil War?
When we look closely at the Civil War, we do find that Rothschild agents are working in the south of the country, Astor agents are working in the north of the country, and these two gentlemen were to found the Round Table, which we might call Fabian Society Round Table, which went on to become the Council of Foreign Relations, Bilderberg and Trilaterate Commission. But going back into those days, there was also an undercurrent of Swiss masonry working away under the surface in the Civil War, and Swiss finance. So what you find as a result of the Civil War was that the banker is becoming really quite dominant as a theme. And when President Lincoln started to print patriotic money, trying to avoid getting involved with European bankers, he was shot dead. I don't have too many questions about who did it and why they did it, which later on may bring us on to President Kennedy.